What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to another datasheet deep dive. We're going to be taking one datasheet in Warhammer 40k and analyzing it in excruciating detail. And today we're going to be talking about what may be one of the best ally units in the game, and that being the character knight, Canis Rex. As always with this video series, we're going to be breaking down Canis Rex's datasheets, many of these synergies that you can use alongside this guy. Because Canis Rex is a potential ally, we're going to be talking about some factions that use him well as some ways that you can use to mitigate his power. So with that, let's dive in and talk about this big chivalric boy. At his baseline, Canis actually has a very similar stat block to almost every other Questoris class knight in the game. He's built off the same chassis as the Knight Preceptor and has largely the same weapons, although his are a special upgraded version. That means he comes in at a relatively fast movement of 10, a resilient toughness 12 with a 3+ armor save and 5+ invulnerable save, specifically against ranged attacks, as well as 22 wounds and 10 objective control. That makes him extremely good at taking objectives, and with the knight's newfound ability to move through ruined terrain, even parts of the ruined terrain feature that are greater than 4 inches high, in exchange for the potential that he might suffer battle shock, Canis Rex is actually maneuverable enough to get to most of those objectives on his own. With a 5+ leadership as well, that battle shock from moving through buildings might be one of the only ways that he actually becomes battle shocked, since this is one of the best leadership characteristics in 40k. Now, that high leadership is incredibly important for Canis Rex because one of the biggest interactions that he has on the battlefield is going to be his legendary free blade ability, and this is kind of the context with which we have to talk about this guy's entire datasheet, because it allows him to discount the cost of a stratagem by 1 once per turn. Now, the ability itself looks like a Rites of Battle ability, but per the June 2024 balance update, which at time of recording went down just a few weeks ago, these abilities have been replaced by effects that reduce the cost of a stratagem by 1 instead of making that stratagem entirely free. However, there are no restrictions on which stratagems can be affected by these abilities, so you can use it on any core stratagems, and if you're playing him in Imperial Knights, you can also use it on any of the really strong Imperial Knight stratagems. Now, on top of this, it has lost the clause where it's able to duplicate a stratagem. That's unfortunate for him, but the flexibility of this effect is a huge upside. You can potentially combo him out with other units that get specific stratagems for free. Things like this Erastus Knight Lancer get tank shock free and are able to duplicate tank shock, which could allow you multiple tank shocks in a single phase, all of which being discounted to 0 CP, with Canis Rex using his first and discounting the cost of that stratagem, then following that up with Lancers who are using that stratagem independently. So there are ways to duplicate very specific stratagems, but that is fairly rare. Now, moving on to his weapon profiles, Canis actually has what is kind of an interesting sub-theme on his own datasheet, and this is actually a design decision that I absolutely love. Rather than just making Canis a character knight with a unique special ability, they've also given him kind of his own identity, and that identity is triggering 5+ sustained hits. The Chainbreaker ability is a special ability that allows every attack that Canis makes to score a critical hit on a 5+. Obviously, if you have any critical effects, that will then trigger those more often than the normal 6 that you would need on standard critical hits. This is useful because they have also then given every single one of Canis Rex's weapons, both melee and ranged weapons, sustained hits 1, meaning that every single one of these are going to be getting that additional hit on a 5 or a 6. Because Canis comes in at a base 2+ ballistic skill and weapon skill on all of his weapon profiles, this Chainbreaker ability essentially means that he will average more hits over a long enough time scale than he makes attacks. And if you are saving your legendary free blade free stratagem use to use on command reroll, he could potentially be taking a missed hit roll and converting it into 2 successful hits. This makes Canis Rex's damage output very consistent, but also potentially spiky. If you roll a bunch of 5s and 6s, he can just go absolutely ham and kill basically anything in the game. And that makes him probably one of the most dangerous single entities in melee out of all of 40k. That's with his Freedom's Hand melee weapon. This comes with a strike profile that has an insane stat block. It only has 5 attacks, so it's a relatively low volume, but again, you're probably expecting 6 or even 7 hits out of this thing, depending on where those hit rolls lie. However, it is at strength 20 AP3 for a flat 9 damage. This guy will essentially rip apart basically any heavy vehicle in the entire game without much problem. Obviously, the one thing that can defeat it are strong invulnerable saves or strong armor saves. A 2+ save with Armor of Contempt, for example, still saves on 4s, but only 2 conversions from Freedom's Hand is enough to mess up basically any other vehicle in the game. That's also enhanced by his sweep profile as well. He has a higher volume attack, which retains that sustained 1 and still hits on 2s, but attacks 10 times, however, only at strength 10, at AP 2 for 3 damage. While this means that he's not the best in the world at clearing infantry in melee, he is extremely good at clearing heavy infantry. Things like Terminators, for example, just get absolutely wrecked by this offensive profile. And with that sustained 1 on a higher attack volume, triggering critical hits on 5-ups, this guy has the potential to go absolutely insane. Now, that effect also translates over to his ranged profiles, and while Canis's ranged attacks aren't the most exciting things in the world, they're definitely not something that you can discount. And one of the big benefits that Canis Rex has is the ability to threaten enemies at a long range and force them to hide out of line of sight, even in an army archetype where you would otherwise not be that worried about their ranged attacks. This comes mostly from his Chainbreaker Las Impulsor. He has a variable profile long range main weapon that can either shoot 2d6 shots at a 36-inch range at strength 7 EP 1 for 2 damage. Again, all of these are going to be getting that sustained hits 1, so high volume attacks are pretty good, and all of its weapons profiles have blast, so they can potentially be triggering some additional shots on larger enemy units. This profile is not too much to write home about. While the high strength, volume, and medium damage is good at clearing infantry, and especially medium infantry profiles, things like Space Marines, the low AP means that most of the time those units are going to be saving on pretty good numbers, and the low intensity Las Impulsor has little chance of doing significant damage unless you absolutely dominate the hit or attack number roll. That said, the high intensity shot is pretty impressive. It shoots D6 blast attacks at strength 14 AP 3 for a flat 4 damage. This makes it extremely good against heavy infantry. You're wounding basically any 3+ wound infantry on 2s, putting them either on an invulnerable save or getting through most of their armor save and one-shotting them with that flat damage value. Unlike a random damage weapon, you don't even need to roll the damage rolls independently. Every single conversion will kill essentially any infantry in 40k. And with blast, if you're firing into a 5 or 6 model unit, you can even be gaining some additional efficiency out of it, which alongside some potential sustained hits allows you to actually be firing this weapon quite a few times. That sustained hits even makes this weapon spiky against heavier targets as well. It is strength 14, so it's wounding even heavy toughness 12 stuff on 3s, and while the D6 shots makes it highly inconsistent, and firing into things in cover with a solid armor save and potentially AP reduction effects means that they will be able to shake most of its hits, there is the potential that Canis Rex could roll a big number of attacks and roll those into additional sustained hits thanks to Chainbreaker to then force through tons and tons of saving throws on a target, each one for 4 damage, meaning that Canis really only has to convert 3 or maybe 4 to kill most vehicles in the game. So while Canis Rex's damage at range is inconsistent, it can never be discounted, and the opponent will have to play around the potential that Canis has to just bust in and shoot down whatever armored target you present him. Now, an idiosyncrasy of this gun is that the high intensity profile is actually a shorter range than the low intensity profile, so the higher damage that this weapon gets, the shorter the range that you can engage at. It is 24 inches, which is generally speaking good enough to hit most things in the game, but it is possible to skirt outside of its range if you are maintaining distance from Canis. Now, on top of that, Canis also has a multi-laser. This also retains the sustained hits 1 of all of his other weapons, but it's only strength 6, AP 0 for 1 damage. A nice little addendum in there, but not too much to be excited about. Now, on top of that, Canis also has a really interesting mechanic that is entirely unique in 40k, and that is his pilot, Sir Hector. On the back of Canis's datasheet, you can find a second datasheet for Sir Hector himself. Sir Hector has a special ability that occurs when the Canis Rex model is destroyed. Sir Hector is then treated as an occupant of Canis Rex, as if Canis Rex was a transport. He then disembarks from Canis Rex, so he sets up within 3 inches of the big knight, then becomes an independent unit. He cannot be targeted by any faction stratagems, and they actually double hit him here. I don't know if there were any particular synergies that they were trying to avoid with that. I don't think any of these stratagems are particularly crazy targeting Sir Hector, but I guess they're nipping that in the bud, especially when we move on to the future and Imperial Knights get additional detachments that they don't want random combinations to be really broken on targeting a single infantry model rather than a big knight. Sir Hector himself is a fairly unremarkable profile. He is a toughness 3 character model, comes in with a 4+ like carapace armor save, 3 wounds. He retains that high leadership characteristic of 5, and he's a lone operative, so he's difficult to take down. cooldown, although only at OC1. This can give you an additional utility unit essentially once Canis Rex is destroyed, which can be super useful. And he comes in with some really interesting, if mediocre, weapon profiles. He's actually really good at Kung Fu with 2 weapon skill 2 melee attacks, although only at strength 3. So while he's probably good at using Canis Rex's big fist in the virtual reality of the night cockpit, once he translates that to real life and uses his regular human arms, it's a little bit less impressive. He also has a really powerful pistol randomly at strength 5 EP1 for 2 damage. Kind of nice for occasionally clocking someone for a couple damage, but not too much to write home about. Now, the real reason that Sir Hector is important is the second clause of his special ability. The Canis Rex unit is not considered to be destroyed until Sir Hector is also destroyed. Now, this is a bizarre ability, and I'll talk about essentially the intended way that this rule operates, at least as far as I can parse it. Any effect that triggers when a model is destroyed will occur when Canis Rex is destroyed. So, for example, like a deadly demise explosion or using the Imperial Knight fight on death. Sir Hector's disembarkation also triggers when the Canis Rex model is destroyed, so that would occur too. Effects that occur when a unit is destroyed trigger only when Sir Hector dies. This is largely for scoring secondary objectives. Canis Rex is actually worthless in terms of secondaries until Sir Hector is also destroyed. Because, for example, to score Bring It Down or Assassination, the Canis Rex unit is still in play, even if the model himself has been removed. Which means that you can actually play Canis Rex kind of aggressively, and as long as you have a good safe place for Sir Hector to dive into once Canis goes down, you're actually not giving up your opponent any efficiency for playing that guy super far forward. Understanding this interaction is actually key, especially in the Pariah Nexus format, where Canis Rex is probably going to be seen quite often, with his ability to bust through terrain features, even ones that are 4 inches or taller. And because Canis Rex can be played in any Imperial subfaction, he's going to be seen quite a bit. Preparing yourself for this effect, where Sir Hector can potentially blank your secondaries, and going all in on killing Canis Rex on the turn that you draw Bring It Down or Assassination, for example, might not be the best plan in the world, is crucially important to keep in mind. Now, the reason that this guy can be taken in other factions is due to the Free Blades ability. Canis Rex comes from the Imperial Knights Index, and this is an ability inside the Imperial Knights Index, and says that if every model in the army has the Imperium keyword, you can include either 3 Armiger models or a single Titanic Imperial Knight, even if they do not have your selected faction keyword. They cannot be the Warlord and can't be given enhancements, which isn't the end of the world for Canis Rex, and simply means that you'll have to take him alongside another character in the army. Canis Rex is probably the most self-sufficient of the Knight chassis, and while I think there are a couple other interesting options that you can include, especially if you're looking for some heavier ranged profiles in the faction, Canis Rex provides Imperium armies a relatively efficient platform that can deal damage both at range and melee. Traditionally, factions that don't have super strong late game melee punch are the ones that enjoy taking Canis Rex the most. That's factions like Adeptus Sororitas and Adeptus Mechanicus. In the past, both of these armies have been particularly good at scoring, but not very good at actually killing enemies, and Canis Rex's ludicrous weapon profiles help shore up that deficit. With the changes to both these sisters' codex being very dangerous, and Adeptus Mechanicus getting lots of faction updates in the recent June data slate, it'll be interesting to see if Canis Rex continues to see play in those factions, but he's also fairly viable in a wide variety of other factions. Adeptus Custodes, for example, use him to shore up their Caladius Grav tank gun lines, and act as another super resilient vehicle that the faction doesn't normally have access to. You also see him in factions like Grey Knights as well, another faction that has some trouble occasionally killing enemy units, especially super highly defended enemy profiles, and Canis Rex can not only act as a very powerful on-board threat that your opponent will have to play around, while the rest of the Grey Knights army jump around the table, scoring objectives and getting weird angles on enemies, but he's also a hyper-resilient unit that can stand on the table and hold down objectives that the faction might not normally traditionally be good at doing. Now, this would normally be the portion of the video where I talked about synergies you can use alongside this datasheet, but one of Canis Rex's hallmarks is that he doesn't really work well with others. He doesn't have any bondsman effect, so he's not able to buff any nearby armigers, and being a big knight himself doesn't really get buffed by anything and can't be enhanced because he's a character. So we're just gonna sort of skip that section, but I think it is important to talk about his legendary free blade ability and his ability to discount stratagem, because there are many stratagems that are super useful to keep in mind with him. The first one is command point reroll. This one is a classic, and if you're in a faction that doesn't typically use a lot of command point rerolls and you have it available to him when he goes to attack, you can essentially use legendary free blade in any faction as if it were kind of an Ironstorm Spearhead sort of effect, where you get a floating reroll each time you attack. attack, whether that's ranged attacks or melee attacks. As I mentioned before, this combines well with his critical 5-ups and sustained hits. He can hit on 2s and use a CP reroll whenever he needs to in order to convert a 1 that he might have rolled that could then potentially convert into 2 additional hits 1/3 of the time. And because his legendary free blade effect occurs each turn, he can also use it on the swing back, either to save himself with rerolling saving throws or doing so in your opponent's turn if they allow him to fight in melee, which honestly they probably shouldn't because he'll kill them. You can also buff his offense even further using Tank Shock. It's a worse effect than it was before the update because obviously swinging a Tank Shock with a strength 20 weapon was much better than doing it with his toughness 12 body, but a free Tank Shock is certainly better than no Tank Shock at all. You can further improve his chances in melee by heroically intervening him for only 1 CP. He is a walker, so he's able to do that despite the fact that it normally disallows vehicles. You can epic challenge him to ensure that you kill specific characters out of an opposing unit. If your opponent is relying on super heavy leadership synergies to swing back at you, you can potentially knock out the character in a unit before they get to attack. So even if his attack volume isn't good enough to kill the entire unit, as long as he has line of sight to the character inside, he can knock them out. Although obviously it is important to remember that leadership effects will persist through the attack activation that kills the leader. So if you're punching into a unit with strong defensive effects and your first attack kills the leader, their defensive leadership abilities will still persist through Canis Rex's activation. Counteroffensive is also a good one. Being able to interrupt for 1 CP instead of 2 because you can discount the cost of the stratagem makes engaging into an army, including Canis Rex, really tough. If you don't battle shock him or attack first into him and you're engaging multiple units across the breadth of the table, he can for only 1 CP and have a pretty good shot at knocking out whatever charged into him. And if you are playing him in Imperial Knights, there are also some obviously incredibly powerful stratagems that you can use for free. Rotate Ion Shields is a big one. Using that for 0 CP is huge, especially because it then allows you command points to potentially CP reroll the resulting 4+ invulnerable save, or vice versa. That can make him really tanky against high damage anti-tank weapons. Things like big laser destroyers and railguns, for example, that impact his invulnerable save. Being able to improve that invulnerable save and reroll it makes him fairly resilient against those styles of attacks. Shoulder the burden if Canis is wounded but not killed allows you to kind of go Super Saiyan a little bit. And once Canis is improved with Shoulder the Burden, he goes absolutely insane. And I think one of the cutest ones is Trophy Claim. You essentially get the entire cost refunded if you're using it. Because Canis Rex can discount the cost of the normally 2 CP stratagem by 1, then you get a CP back if you complete your Trophy Claim. You essentially get the use of the stratagem for free. The downside is that it's a little inconsistent doing it at ranged. +1 to wound with his last impulsor is good, but there is the potential that you roll 1 shot, for example, and just bounce off whatever you're shooting at. Again, his ranged output is incredibly swingy, but you can use it to ensure that he kills a monster or vehicle that he's engaging in melee. Now, last but certainly not least, before we wrap up the video, we can talk momentarily about dealing with big knights. Canis Rex is not really defensively more difficult to kill than any other Questoris class knight, so if you are experienced against the knight profiles, you shouldn't have too much trouble with him. He obviously can protect himself a little bit with stratagems more often than a normal knight can, but he is defensively identical. The one downside is that he is very difficult to battle shock, so if you have battle shock synergies or you are trying to battle shock him to prevent him from using his defensive stratagems, that is very difficult because of his extremely strong leadership value of 5, but otherwise he's basically exactly the same. So if your list is good at killing knights, they will be good at killing Canis Rex. And the Questoris chassis has some pretty important weaknesses. First off, it's only a 3+ armor save, so if you are able to get mass attacks through with a decent enough AP to punch through onto their invulnerable save, these knights will go down fairly quickly. At toughness 12, it is difficult to get to a level of strength that does that at a high volume, but if you have effects like lethal hits, for example, you can combo out enough attacks that these guys do go down fairly quickly. On top of that, big knights are also susceptible to maybe being movement blocked. Despite the updates to Super Heavy Walker, there are some things that you can do to prevent Canis Rex and other similar knights from moving at you. Importantly, they still have to clear the terrain features that they're moving through with their base in order to be allowed to move through them. And placing your models in such a way that your engagement range prevents those knights from being able to complete that movement legally can actually still trap them behind buildings. Move blocking big knights was super important in the past, and while it is important to keep in mind that he can move over most enemy units, as always, these super heavy walkers do need to have room for their base to place outside of enemy engagement ranges, and so blocking that space off with your units can prevent them from moving moving up the table. Especially if you can conjoin that with the areas of terrain that they would like to be moving through, but still can't end inside. So you can create situations where whole areas of the table are impossible for these enormous knight bases to complete their movement through. Locking Canis Rex into a ranged posture by preventing him from getting into melee eliminates the most powerful attacks that he has, and the longer you can do that and the more you can chip damage into him, the better off you're going to be in the long run. But that's all I have to say about Canis Rex. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this guy and about the fact that he can be included in so many Imperium lists. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.